Hello Weiss players, welcome to Weiss Academy. So this is the start of our channel and we are a group of long-term Weiss players based in Calgary. We're hoping to bring some informational and fun content to our favorite trading card game. For today's topic, what I would like to talk about are the different types of decks that exist in modern Weiss Schwarz. Whether you're a new player or a veteran looking for the next deck to build, we hope that this can give you some key information and that we can start a discussion about a very underrated topic. At least that's what I believe in the game. So, to give some historical context, this topic isn't usually talked about because in Old Weiss, there weren't that many different types of decks. A long time ago, many decks all played the same compress and heal and sustain strategy. This is because many decks lacked an efficient or just had an entirely lack thereof resource engine to which they can use to close out the game. If you notice in today's modern game standards, many decks have strong finishers that accelerate the gameplay, but that was not the case a long time ago. As such, pretty much all competitive decks just try to conserve their resources and out-sustain their opponent. Of course, there were aggro decks sprinkled throughout this period, especially two-soul rush decks, but these decks were a bit more on the meme side compared to competitive. After a bit, the game began to develop more and more. Bushiroad identified many popular card profiles that the players enjoyed and began to recycle their design, and many decks kind of had similar tools just with slightly different flavor of climax combos. So this led to a period where many decks were basically all combo decks and just had different level 1 and level 3 combos, but the rest of the deck and the playstyle was essentially the same. However, if you fast forward to today, in Modern Weiss Schwarz, we have finally reached a time where there are many distinct styles of decks, each with their own style of play. And that's why I think this is a great time to bring up a discussion about this topic. So, as a disclaimer, these deck types or deck categories that I have come up with are not official. They're what I discussed with my close group of friends and our community here. And I'm just using this to express my personal opinion and to start a discussion about this topic. All right. So, here are the 6 deck archetypes in my opinion. So there is one aggro, mid-range, combo, standby and board-based decks, tempo decks, and compression and stall decks that still exist in the metagame. I will go in depth about each one, and you can kind of check them out, see what I describe them as, and see if you're interested in any of these playstyles. So the first one is aggro. So aggro decks, I have identified the defining traits as decks that can play with little to no resources, and their game plan is to aim to push early damage as fast as possible. So they have a lot of ways to manipulate soul in their deck, and these decks usually can slam a climax every turn. When it gets to the end game, these decks play efficient finishers to close out the game, assuming that they created and maintained a damage lead throughout the game. So good examples of these aggro decks are one, the two soul combo from The Day I Became a God. So this deck is really good at searching out the two soul climax, and they are able to play it every turn to swing for big damage, and they didn't care what cards that you had on your board. They're just trying to hit face as fast as possible and then finish you off with their efficient Hina finisher, which can do 2 instances of 1 damage just by discarding a card, assuming they have events in the memory. Other good examples are Grisaya with their aggro strategy and anti-heal, as well as Zombieland Saga with their level 0 rush strategy. I think just generic 2-soul decks are dead by modern Weiss standards. Most aggro decks need to have a bit more to kind of like prop themselves up in today's metagame. So the next type of deck are mid-range decks. So these decks are what I would call the well-balanced decks in the game. So these decks have tools for all phases of the game. They generally play answers at least some answers to what your opponent is trying to do, cards that can answer the board, cards that can help you sustain, as well as cards that can help you close out the game. So these decks focus on consistency and efficiency, but they don't have the highest ceiling in the game. So some examples of these decks are Door Gate Damachi. So this is a very consistent and efficient deck that has amazing search and salvage capabilities throughout the game. They can consistently get to whatever cards they want, and they can play a CX turn after turn to kind of push the game along. Their finisher is extremely efficient because it's a stock healer. Sometimes you only need 4 stock to play out all 3 Hestias and swing for increased soul damage. That also burns you for 2 if you cancel their Hestia swings. Another example would be something like Saikano, right? Saikano doesn't have the most amazing finisher, but it is super consistent with all the resource generation, memory tools, and the fact that they can kind of like climb into their finisher with a series of change cards that change from a 0 to a 1 to 2 to their level 3. They can find their finisher turn after turn. Their finisher is hard to interact with as it is hexproof, and when they attack you can't play backups. So it has little counterplay, so the damage they output is consistent. So these are why I would consider mid-range decks. Next, we have a deck style that some people love but others may hate. So these are the combo type decks in Weiss Schwarz. So recently these decks have become increasingly popular, and I would argue that they are kind of like the focal point of today's metagame. So the defining traits of these combo decks are that they have strong resource generation, they can play aggressively early if they want, and their game plan is focused on like gathering a lot of resources to make a strong level 3 push that can kill their opponent easily, even sometimes from level 2. So these decks have extremely high ceilings on their finishers, but they generally require a lot of resources to do so. A lot of times these decks will want to have at least 8 stock at level 3 and a full hand. So example of this is 8 Door Assault Lily with their level 3 door combo that gives other characters on attack mill 3 of bottom opponent deck and burn X for however many climaxes you hit. So if you have 2 of those, you can give that twice to this blue card you see on the screen here, which is a restander. So it can attack, mill bottom 3 twice, restand, attack again, mill bottom 3 twice. And this is extremely powerful. Now there are other examples of combo decks out there as well, of course, but you can identify these based on the fact that they want to gather up resources and make a giant level 3 push. I think these decks are weak to some of the tools that exist in the game, however, for example, such as stock swap. So a stock swap is extremely good against these decks that want to kind of save up all these resources, because you can kind of ruin their compression and maybe push them for game to where they are not expecting it. Alright, and then next up are standby and board-based decks. So I think this archetype of decks is the closest to what comes to be as control decks in Weiss Schwarz. So control is a concept that is extremely hard to translate and define in Weiss Schwarz, I feel, because of how different this game plays compared to other decks. But with standby board-based decks, these decks try to win the board by having characters that are just higher power level than your opponent and walling off your opponent because they just can't kill anything on your board, and you gain advantage by having these cards on board throughout the course of several turns. When you do this, a lot of times you can stop clocking early in the game to conserve damage, and you can build a ton of stock once you have established your board and are given a turn or 2 to do so. This allows for strong defensive options such as powerful events, as well as cards like Wushoku's Tap Counter, which you need 5 stock and another discard to rest one of your opponent's characters, but it is well worth it to stay alive. Other examples of board-based decks, aside from 8 standby decks, would be something like the Kanata Marine deck in Hololive. That deck plays out a bunch of level 3s that is difficult for your opponent to remove, and they can kind of control the game state defensively by through all their different backups. Of course, they have the Kanata backup, the vanilla 3K, that changes into the level 3 healer. They have an anti-change as well as tap counter, and they can access all their tools through their climax combo as they need. So these decks can be quite strong, but they often don't have the best finishing power. So they need to build a lead in the mid game to stay ahead. Next up, we have what I consider tempo decks. So the defining traits for these decks are decks that facilitate a game plan that revolves around pushing for a bunch of damage or tempo in the mid game, and they try to close out the game with that lead. So the example I have for this is D-Side. Now D-Side may not be the best example because that deck is so powerful that it can do almost everything. I think the only thing the deck really lacks is a strong defensive option, but that doesn't matter when they can send a million cards to memory for free and have a one-stock healer starting from level 2. So if you're unfamiliar with D-Side, what they can do is they have a 2-1 that on play sends this level 3 on screen from their waiting room to the memory. And then if you play the climax combo, you can send the 2-1 on your stage to memory to play the level 3, which on play heals a card. Now this level 3 combos with the same climax to be able to on attack, pay 1, discard 1, burn 4, with memory condition I believe, and on reverse it can also pay 1 and discard 1 to also burn 1. Of course, most players just use this as an official heal engine starting from level 2, in which you get a bunch of one-stock heals, and you can try to push for a bunch of damage with your climax combo. You don't have to use the burn, but if you see that your opponent is uncompressed, you can just bonk them for 4 damage with your burn and see how far ahead you get. So decks like these, they damage race you starting from level 2. They try to get a lead and finish you off while maintaining that lead. So these decks can be quite scary if you don't have your setup ready to go. If you had a weak early game, these decks will roll you over. Other examples can be like English Love Live Sunshine, since they don't quite have as many restrictions, as well as something like Symphogear, where they have their double finishers that play off each other and try to push you for a lot of damage at level 2 while not like paying a bunch of resources, so they can like do the same thing all over again next turn, especially if you can't remove the level 3s that they put out on the board. Okay, and then coming up we have the last type of deck. So these decks are what I consider compression and stall decks. So these decks are reminiscent of the decks early on in Weiss Schwarz. They try to gain advantage by dragging out the game. They generally have ways to thin their deck size to increase the chances of canceling, and efficient ways to heal off damage to out-sustain you. I would consider like -2 soul decks and other soul suppressed decks part of this category as well. So the example I have here is the infamous Doorgate Slime, where they send a bunch of cards to memory and they can start playing out their healers at level 2, which also have Hand Encore, so they're annoying to get rid of. And even if you do, they can play some more next turn because it doesn't cost a lot of stock to play it out. However, these decks generally also have the trait of having low finishing reach. So against these decks, you generally don't have to worry about dying from like level 2 or sometimes maybe even 3-0 because they're just trying to hit you with vanilla swings for game. So if you're compressed with climaxes in your deck, these decks have a hard time finishing you off. Alright, so those are the 6 different types of decks I would consider that exist in modern Weiss Schwarz. Just to go over them again, there was aggro, mid-range, combo, standby and board-based decks, which is similar to control, tempo, and compression and stall decks. So thank you for watching the video. Let me know in the comments if there's a category of decks that you feel that exist in the game that I missed, or if you disagree with anything I said, because we're just trying to start a discussion here. Any type of discourse is appreciated. Offer your insights, post in the comments. We'll see you next time.